The story did not begin with violence. It rarely does. It began with a post that looked ordinary, almost forgettable, sitting among thousands of others scrolling endlessly through screens across the world. A message typed casually, shared impulsively, framed in certainty without evidence. It carried urgency, outrage, and a promise that something hidden had finally been revealed. For many who saw it, the post did not feel dangerous. It felt important. Online hoaxes do not announce themselves as falsehoods. They arrive wearing the language of truth. Screenshots replace proof, anonymous sources replace accountability, emotional language replaces verification. In the early days of widespread social media, this kind of misinformation traveled slowly, limited by forums and email chains. But as platforms evolved, speed became its greatest weapon. The first known cases of online hoaxes causing real harm emerged quietly. No dramatic headlines at first, just confusion, people showing up at places they should not be, harassment aimed at the wrong individuals, panic triggered by fabricated threats. The damage accumulated in fragments scattered across timelines and comment sections. In one early case, a false warning circulated claiming a specific food product was poisoned. The message urged parents to act immediately to protect their children before it was too late. It spread through parenting groups and private chats faster than any official correction could follow. Stores were flooded with frightened customers, employees were threatened, supply chains were disrupted. Though no one died, the psychological harm lingered. Trust had been shaken by something that never existed. What made hoaxes powerful was not their creativity, but their familiarity. They exploited existing fears, crime, children, health, politics. They did not need to invent danger, only redirect it. The lie succeeded because it sounded like something people already believed could be true. As platforms grew larger, hoaxes became more targeted. Anonymous users learned how algorithms worked. They understood which words triggered engagement, which emotions encouraged sharing. Fear, anger, and moral outrage proved especially effective. The goal was no longer to convince everyone, it was to activate enough people to create momentum. Law enforcement initially struggled to respond. Online misinformation did not fit traditional crime models. There was no clear victim, no obvious crime scene. Jurisdiction became complicated when posts crossed borders in seconds. By the time authorities became aware, the damage was often already done. In one notorious case, a fabricated story accused a local business owner of running a criminal operation. The claim was supported by doctored images and false testimonies from accounts that appeared independent but were coordinated. The hoax spread rapidly through local community groups. Within days, the man received threats. His business was vandalized. His family went into hiding. By the time the truth emerged, the harm was irreversible. His reputation never fully recovered. The hoaxer was never identified. What shocked investigators was how ordinary the participants appeared. Most people who shared the false story believed they were doing the right thing. They were protecting others. They were warning their community. Few stopped to question the source. Fewer still paused long enough to verify. This was the most dangerous aspect of online hoaxes. They did not rely on malice alone. They relied on trust. Trust in familiar language, trust in shared values, trust in the assumption that someone else had already checked. As the years passed, hoaxes escalated from reputational harm to physical danger. False reports of active threats triggered emergency responses. Fake crime accusations led to real confrontations. In extreme cases, armed individuals arrived at locations mentioned in fabricated stories, convinced they were intervening in real crimes. These incidents forced authorities to acknowledge a new reality. Digital lies could produce physical consequences. Screens were no longer separate from streets. What happened online did not stay online. Psychologists studying these cases noticed a pattern. Hoaxes succeeded when they offered clarity in chaotic times. They provided villains and victims. They simplified complex situations into shareable narratives. In doing so, they removed nuance, replacing it with certainty. For those targeted by hoaxes, the experience was disorienting. Many described a sense of helplessness as strangers formed opinions based on false information. Attempts to correct the record often failed. Denials were treated as evidence of guilt. Silence was interpreted as confirmation. The truth moved slower than the lie. Platforms introduced moderation tools, but enforcement lagged behind innovation. New accounts appeared faster than old ones could be removed. Coordinated campaigns became harder to trace. The responsibility for verification remained largely with users, many of whom lacked the time or resources to investigate. The line between prank and crime blurred. Some hoaxes were created for attention, others for ideological reasons. A few were driven by personal grudges. Regardless of motive, the impact was often the same. Fear spread, trust eroded, real people suffered. By the time governments began proposing regulations, the damage was already global. Hoaxes had crossed languages, cultures, and legal systems. The question was no longer whether online lies could cause harm. That had been proven. The question was how much harm could occur before accountability caught up. Scene 1 ends not with resolution, but with recognition. The internet had created a space where truth and fiction shared the same pathways, moving at the same speed. In that space, belief became a force, capable of shaping actions, decisions, and consequences. The stories that followed would show what happens when belief is weaponized, when hoaxes leave screens behind and enter the real world. As online hoaxes evolved, they began to exploit not just fear, but coordination. What once spread organically through confusion now moved deliberately through design. False stories were no longer accidents of misunderstanding. They were engineered narratives structured to provoke action. And when action followed belief, real harm became inevitable. One of the earliest wake-up calls came when a fabricated online rumor triggered a real-world emergency response. A false claim of an active threat circulated rapidly, complete with invented details that sounded operationally plausible. Locations were named, timelines were specified. The language mimicked official warnings. Within minutes, panic set in. Schools went into lockdown, streets were cleared, emergency services were overwhelmed responding to a threat that never existed. Investigators later traced the origin to an anonymous account created hours earlier. The motive was unclear. There was no demand, no manifesto, just disruption. Yet the consequences were severe. Resources were diverted away from genuine emergencies. People were injured during evacuations. The public's trust in warnings weakened, creating future risk when real threats emerged. Another case revealed how hoaxes could weaponize crowds against individuals. A false accusation posted online claimed that a private citizen had committed a violent crime. The post included a name, an address, and a fabricated backstory designed to inflame outrage. The claim spread rapidly through local forums and social media groups, reinforced by comments demanding justice. By nightfall, the individual's home was surrounded. Shouting crowds gathered. Property was damaged. Police were called not to investigate a crime, but to protect someone from one that existed only online. The accused had no warning. They learned of the hoax as it unfolded, watching strangers form opinions in real time based on a lie. Attempts to correct the narrative failed. Official statements were dismissed as cover-ups. Evidence was ignored. The hoax had already taken on a life of its own. It fed on repetition rather than truth. Each share became validation. Each comment amplified certainty. In another incident, a coordinated hoax targeted a public venue. False claims alleged illegal activity inside a specific business. Anonymous accounts encouraged others to do something before authorities could intervene. Though the messages never explicitly called for violence, the implication was clear. Responsibility was being transferred to the crowd. Armed individuals arrived believing they were preventing a crime. The confrontation that followed was brief but dangerous. No one was killed, but lives were permanently altered. The hoaxer was later identified as someone seeking online attention, unaware or indifferent to the consequences. The gap between intention and impact became impossible to ignore. Law enforcement agencies struggled to adapt. Traditional investigative tools were ill-suited to digital misinformation. Jurisdictional boundaries meant little when content crossed borders instantly. Platforms were slow to cooperate, citing privacy and scale. By the time posts were removed, screenshots ensured they lived on. Psychologists observed that hoaxes thrive during periods of uncertainty. Social tension, political polarization, and fear created fertile ground. In those moments, people sought simple explanations and decisive action. Hoaxes offered both. They replaced complexity with urgency. The people who shared false information were rarely malicious. Many believed they were helping. They trusted the tone of authority, the emotional framing, the apparent consensus. The act of sharing felt responsible, even moral. Few considered the possibility that they were contributing to harm. For victims, the damage extended beyond immediate danger. Reputations were destroyed. Mental health suffered. Some moved away. Others withdrew from public life entirely. Even after hoaxes were debunked, traces remained online, resurfacing years later with renewed impact. Platforms responded with warnings and fact-check labels, but hoax creators adapted. They used coded language. They shifted to private groups. They framed claims as questions rather than statements. Just asking became a shield against accountability. Doubt itself was weaponized. In some cases, hoaxes escalated into cycles of retaliation. False claims prompted responses that generated new misinformation. Each side accused the other of deception. Truth became irrelevant. What mattered was momentum. Engagement rewarded extremes, not accuracy. Legal consequences were rare. Laws struggled to define responsibility for harm caused indirectly through digital speech. Prosecutors faced challenges proving intent, causation, and jurisdiction. Many cases ended without charges, reinforcing the perception that online actions carried limited risk. By the end of this phase, one reality became clear. Hoaxes were no longer isolated incidents. They were part of a broader pattern where digital narratives could mobilize real-world behavior at scale. Screens had become staging grounds. Belief had become a trigger. The harm caused by online hoaxes was no longer hypothetical or rare. It was repeatable, predictable, and growing. What remained uncertain was whether systems built for information sharing could be reshaped to prevent belief from turning into violence again. Online hoaxes reached a new level of danger when they began exploiting identity itself. No longer content with spreading false stories, some hoaxers learned how to fabricate people, conversations, and evidence so convincingly that even trained professionals hesitated. What followed was a wave of cases where reality fractured and innocent people found themselves trapped inside crimes that existed only online. One such case began with a profile that appeared ordinary, a name, photos, years of activity, friends interacting naturally in comments. The account accused a local teacher of inappropriate behavior, posting alleged screenshots of conversations that seemed explicit and detailed. The images spread rapidly, shared by people who believed they were exposing wrongdoing. Schools were alerted, parents panicked, the teacher was suspended within hours. The screenshots were fake. Forensic analysts later proved they had been stitched together from unrelated conversations, timestamps altered, names swapped. But by the time this was confirmed, the damage had already occurred. The teacher received threats, their family was harassed, news outlets reported the allegations before verification, embedding the accusation permanently into search results. Even after retractions, suspicion lingered. The hoax had succeeded not because it was flawless, but because it arrived first. In another case, a fabricated online persona spent months building trust within a mental health support community. The account shared personal struggles, offered empathy, and became a respected voice. Then, abruptly, it accused a member of abuse, describing private conversations in detail. The community reacted with outrage. The accused was expelled, publicly shamed, and reported to authorities. Investigators later discovered the accuser never existed. The persona was a composite managed by someone using stolen photos and automated tools to simulate interaction. The harm was real. The accused experienced severe psychological distress. The community fractured. Trust evaporated. No apology could undo the sense of betrayal. These cases revealed how hoaxes no longer relied on viral spread alone. They relied on patience. Some were cultivated slowly, embedding themselves into digital spaces until credibility was unquestioned. When the lie finally surfaced, it carried the weight of accumulated trust. Law enforcement began encountering hoaxes that mimicked criminal evidence. Fake tip lines flooded with coordinated reports, fabricated witness statements submitted through online portals, even falsified digital trails designed to implicate specific individuals. Each false lead consumed time and resources, delaying responses to genuine cases. One investigation stalled for weeks chasing a suspect who did not exist. The hoaxer had created a detailed online footprint, including social media activity, location check-ins, and even fabricated acquaintances who vouched for the identity. It took extensive cross-platform analysis to unravel the deception. Meanwhile, the real perpetrator remained free. Victims of these hoaxes described a unique form of helplessness. Unlike physical crimes, there was no clear boundary where harm began or ended. The attack followed them everywhere. Screens became sources of anxiety. Notifications triggered fear. Even silence felt dangerous, as absence online could be interpreted as guilt. Mental health professionals began documenting symptoms similar to trauma responses: hypervigilance, withdrawal, sleep disruption, the sense of being watched, judged, and misrepresented by strangers. Unlike traditional crimes, there was often no resolution, no clear moment when the threat ended. Platforms struggled to respond effectively. Verification processes were slow. Appeals systems overwhelmed. Algorithms continued to promote engagement even when content was disputed. False information often spread faster than corrections, especially when framed emotionally. Hoaxers adapted quickly. When platforms introduced detection tools, they shifted tactics. They used satire as cover. They framed accusations as hypothetical scenarios. They relied on implication rather than direct statements. This ambiguity made enforcement difficult and allowed harm to continue under the guise of discussion. In some cases, hoaxes escalated into coordinated harassment campaigns. False narratives were reinforced through repeated posting, tagging employers, contacting family members, and flooding reporting systems. The goal was not persuasion, but exhaustion, to overwhelm targets until withdrawal became the only option. Legal systems lagged behind. Defamation laws required clear attribution. Criminal statutes struggled to define intent in decentralized campaigns. Many hoaxers operated anonymously, shielded by jurisdictional complexity. Even when identified, consequences were often minimal compared to the harm inflicted. What made these cases especially dangerous was how convincingly they blended truth and fiction. real screenshots mixed with fake ones, genuine concerns paired with false accusations. The line between skepticism and complicity blurred. People who questioned the narrative were accused of defending wrongdoing. Silence was treated as consent. Communities fractured under this pressure. Online spaces meant for support became arenas of suspicion. Moderators resigned, members left. The damage extended beyond individuals, reshaping digital environments permanently. Researchers studying these incidents noted a shift in how truth functioned online. Verification was replaced by alignment. People judged information not by accuracy, but by whether it matched their existing beliefs. Hoaxes succeeded when they confirmed what audiences already suspected. The cost was measured not only in ruined lives, but in eroded trust. Each exposed hoax made future warnings less credible. Real victims feared disbelief. Genuine allegations faced skepticism fueled by past deception. The cycle fed itself. By the time awareness caught up, the architecture of harm was already in place. Tools designed to connect people had become instruments of manipulation. Identity itself could be forged, weaponized, and discarded. What remained was a growing recognition that online hoaxes were no longer fringe phenomena. They were capable of replicating the effects of serious crimes without physical contact, without clear perpetrators, and without straightforward remedies. The consequences would only deepen as technology advanced, lowering the barrier to fabrication even further. The next stories would show how hoaxes moved beyond individuals and communities, shaping public behavior on a scale that left lasting scars in the real world. As online hoaxes matured, they began to intersect with moments of real-world crises, amplifying harm far beyond individual victims. Natural disasters, public health emergencies, and acts of violence created environments where fear already existed. Hoaxers learned that in these moments, false information did not need to be persuasive, it only needed to be fast. During one public health emergency, a fabricated warning spread claiming that emergency responders were secretly withholding aid from certain neighborhoods. The message included falsified documents, altered logos, and quotes attributed to officials who did not exist. It spread rapidly through private messaging groups, especially among communities already distrustful of authorities. As panic grew, people refused legitimate help. Ambulances were blocked, medical workers were harassed, lives were put at risk, not because of the crisis itself, but because belief had been redirected. In another case, a hoax falsely announced the death of a public figure during a period of civil tension. The claim spread globally within minutes, triggering protests, panic buying, and confrontations between groups who believed violence was imminent. By the time the claim was officially denied, damage had already been done. Businesses were destroyed, people were injured, the correction never reached the same audience as the lie. Investigators later discovered the hoax originated from a small group coordinating across platforms, deliberately timing the release to coincide with peak online activity. Their goal was disruption rather than profit. They exploited the speed of modern communication, knowing that retractions move slower than outrage. Emergency services increasingly found themselves responding to false threats generated online. Fake reports of mass casualties, bomb threats, and active attackers flooded call centers. Each report required verification. Each response diverted resources from genuine emergencies. In one documented incident, a delayed response contributed to real loss of life elsewhere. The hoax did not pull the trigger, but it shaped the conditions under which harm occurred. The psychological toll on first responders was significant. Many described a growing sense of uncertainty, never knowing whether the next call was real or fabricated. Trust in information streams eroded, fatigue increased. Decision-making slowed as verification became necessary even under pressure. Hoaxes also targeted institutions directly. False claims accused hospitals of illegal activity, election officials of manipulation, and schools of endangering children. These narratives did not rely on proof, they relied on repetition. Once enough people believed, the institution's response itself became suspect. Denials were reframed as evidence of guilt. In several cases, hoaxes triggered self-appointed enforcers. Ordinary individuals, convinced they were acting morally, confronted staff, recorded interactions, and posted edited footage online. Context was stripped away. Moments of confusion were presented as admissions. The cycle fed itself, producing new misinformation from attempts to correct old ones. Platforms attempted to intervene by flagging disputed content, but this often backfired. For some audiences, warnings reinforced belief. The presence of a label was interpreted as censorship. Hoaxers exploited this reaction, framing themselves as truth-tellers being silenced. Their narratives gained credibility precisely because they were challenged. Researchers observed that hoaxes thrived in environments where people felt excluded from official channels of information. When trust in institutions was low, alternative narratives flourished. Hoaxes did not create distrust, they capitalized on it. The real harm extended beyond immediate incidents. Long-term consequences emerged as people adjusted behavior based on false beliefs. Vaccination rates dropped after hoaxes spread misinformation. Communities avoided emergency shelters due to fabricated dangers. Election workers resigned after facing harassment driven by false claims. In one particularly severe case, a hoax falsely claimed that a missing person had been located and was being held by a specific family. The accusation spread rapidly, fueled by emotional appeals and unverified images. The family's home was surrounded, windows were broken. Police intervened just in time to prevent serious violence. The missing person was later found unharmed, with no connection to the accused. The hoaxer later admitted they had intended to help by encouraging public attention. They did not anticipate the scale of reaction. This pattern repeated across cases. The gap between intention and outcome remained vast, but harm did not depend on intent. Legal systems struggled to respond effectively. Prosecuting hoax-related harm required proving causation across digital and physical spaces. Defense arguments emphasized free speech, lack of direct instruction, and unforeseeable reactions. Many cases resulted in no charges or minimal penalties, reinforcing a sense of impunity. Victims found little relief. Civil lawsuits were costly and slow. Platforms removed content inconsistently. Even when hoaxes were debunked, remnants persisted through reposts, archives, and screenshots. The internet did not forget easily. Over time, the public grew more cautious, but also more cynical. Genuine warnings were sometimes dismissed as hoaxes. Real victims faced disbelief. The erosion of trust became its own form of damage, harder to measure but deeply influential. Experts warned that the line between misinformation and psychological harm had effectively disappeared. Hoaxes could traumatize communities without ever touching them physically. Fear itself became the weapon. As technology advanced, concerns intensified. AI tools made fabrications more convincing. Images, audio, and video could be manipulated with increasing realism. The effort required to create believable hoaxes dropped dramatically, while the potential impact grew. Institutions raced to adapt, but change was slow. Education campaigns encouraged skepticism. Platforms adjusted algorithms. Law enforcement developed digital literacy units. These efforts helped, but they could not eliminate the underlying vulnerability. Human belief remained the entry point. By this stage, it was clear that online hoaxes were not simply lies told for amusement. They were force multipliers, capable of shaping behavior, mobilizing crowds, and redirecting resources in moments of vulnerability. The harm they caused was no longer incidental. It was structural, embedded in how information moved and how people responded to it. The final stories would focus not on the hoaxes themselves, but on the reckoning that followed, when societies were forced to confront how easily belief could be turned against them. The final reckoning with online hoaxes did not arrive as a single event. It unfolded slowly through courtrooms, policy debates, shattered lives, and quiet realizations among people who once believed sharing information was harmless. By the time societies began to fully understand the scale of damage, the question was no longer how hoaxes caused harm, but how much harm had already been normalized. Some of the most sobering moments came during legal proceedings. Victims stood before judges explaining how a post they never saw coming had dismantled their lives. Careers lost, not through evidence, but through accusation. Relationships broken by suspicion that never fully faded. In many cases, there was no clear perpetrator to hold accountable. The harm had been crowdsourced, fragmented across thousands of shares, likes, and comments, each too small to prosecute on its own. Courts struggled to apply old laws to new realities. Defamation statutes required identifiable authors. Criminal laws demanded intent and direct causation. Hoaxes, however, thrived on diffusion. Responsibility was diluted until it nearly vanished. Even when a hoaxer was identified, penalties often felt symbolic compared to the consequences suffered by victims. Governments responded unevenly. Some introduced legislation targeting malicious misinformation, especially when linked to physical harm. Others hesitated, wary of infringing on free expression. The debate became polarized. One side argued that regulation was essential to protect public safety. The other warned that defining truth by law was dangerous. In the middle were victims, still searching for repair rather than resolution. Platforms announced reforms. Algorithms were adjusted to slow the spread of unverified claims. Fact-checking partnerships expanded. Reporting tools improved. Yet these changes were reactive, always one step behind evolving tactics. Hoaxers adapted quickly, moving to private groups, encrypted platforms, or subtle forms of implication that avoided outright falsehood while still causing harm. Education emerged as a long-term response. Schools introduced digital literacy programs, teaching students how to verify sources, recognize emotional manipulation, and question virality. These efforts showed promise, but their impact would take years to measure. Meanwhile, adults already immersed in online ecosystems often resisted changing habits formed over decades. Psychologists began reframing hoax harm as a public health issue. Chronic exposure to misinformation created anxiety, mistrust, and social fragmentation. Communities became more suspicious. Dialogue became more hostile. People retreated into spaces where their beliefs were reinforced rather than challenged. Hoaxes did not just misinform, they reshaped how people related to one another. Some victims found ways to reclaim their narratives. They spoke publicly, wrote accounts, and advocated for reform. Their stories highlighted a crucial truth. The harm of hoaxes was not abstract, it was personal, intimate, and enduring. Even after vindication, the emotional residue remained. Being falsely accused changed how people saw the world and how the world saw them. Researchers studying long-term effects noticed a troubling pattern. As hoaxes became more common, outrage fatigue set in. People stopped reacting strongly, even to real crises. The line between truth and fiction blurred to the point where urgency lost meaning. This erosion of response carried its own risks, especially during genuine emergencies. The most unsettling realization was how ordinary the process had become. Hoaxes did not require sophisticated skills. They required timing, emotional framing, and an understanding of attention. The same tools used for connection could be used for destruction without ever leaving a screen. In reflecting on these stories, investigators often return to a single theme. The internet did not create cruelty or fear, it accelerated them. It removed friction, allowing belief to move faster than reflection. In that speed, harm found opportunity. The future remained uncertain. Technology would continue to evolve. Fabrication would become easier. Detection would become harder. The balance between openness and protection would remain fragile. But awareness had grown. The stories of harm had been documented. The cost of ignoring misinformation was no longer theoretical. What remained was responsibility, not only for platforms or governments, but for individuals. Each share, each comment, each moment of certainty carried weight. The stories showed that harm did not always come from intent, but from participation. Online hoaxes thrived in moments of trust misplaced and urgency unchecked. They ended not with confession or punishment, but with consequences that outlived the lie itself. Reputations altered, communities divided, lives reshaped. The final lesson was not about technology, but about belief. When truth becomes optional, harm becomes inevitable. And in a world where stories travel instantly, the choice to pause, verify, and doubt became one of the last defenses against turning fiction into tragedy. The hoaxes faded, the damage remained.